Fight fans, I'm here with Colleen Aycock, author and writer of some of the books of the turn of the centuries, Joe Gans and the First Black Champions. Hello Colleen, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm just great because I'm talking to you, EJ.
Thanks. Alright then. Where should we start? We tell the fight fans about your work and how did you get into boxing?
Oh, you know what? Can I ask you that question? Because you see, there's a huge age gap between us. You're young, I'm old. And so I want to ask you, how did you get started? What interested you in boxing? How did you get interested in it?
Okay, this is a first. No one's ever asked me that question before. Okay, so I'm going to tell the fight fans and yourself how I got into it. So my first time I actually watched film was Muhammad Ali against Trevor Berbick. I believe it was on BBC One over here in the UK, London, England, and it was Muhammad Ali. He lost the fight, and that was my first recording of a fight. But then later on I saw Barry McGuigan. He lost to Steve Cruz. I used to follow his career, and then I saw Frank Bruno when he was up and coming, and when he lost to Tim Witherspoon, and then later on I sort of followed Mike Tyson. And his career, obviously, he beat Bruno and went on to unify the belts. But through Mike Tyson, he was interested in all the old fighters, Joe Louis, and he had extent history. So when they had interviews with him, he mentioned all the old fighters, and that's how I got interested in all the other old fighters. And I thought, oh wow, there's all these other guys I never knew of, and it's black and white. So obviously through Mike Tyson, that's how I got to know the history of the game. That's how I came into boxing.
Well, I love the connection because you know what, EJ, that's exactly how I got interested in boxing, through the television. Because, now here's the difference. My father was a boxer, a professional boxer in the Depression. So you have to go back to the 1930s to see, to understand what he was all about. But when we got a television, everything was black and white, and there weren't a billion channels. There were just a couple. But you know what? There was Friday night fights. And what would we do? If we wanted to watch the television, which was just a great treat for us, for the kids, we had to watch what Dad was watching. And the difference is that I was a little girl among all these boys, and my father, and you know what? I think I heard something a little bit different from what the normal person hears, because my father was a professional. He was so passionate about those fights. And probably I didn't pick up too much then, but I picked up the passion because these were the old fights. Even on the replays, they showed these old fights on television. Can you imagine if we would all see these fights on television? I mean, now we are starting to see them on channels like YouTube, but it was there in my living room. Oh my gosh, my father measured my biceps. Most kids, I thought I was going to be a boxer. I had no idea that I was a little girl, and at that time, oh my goodness. A world of difference. But you know what? We all get started the same way. It's because we have access to the fights and to something that's really fabulous and to something that's beautiful. And so it bothers me a bit when the fights don't get the exposure, and certainly in America, the pay-per-view fights are so expensive that people they don't have access to them. Do you know, in the old days, they used to show these fights in the theaters. I would love to have a theater that would be designated for some pay-per-view fight. And can you imagine having several hundred, even 1,000 people show up and get in line to watch these fights with the group that size in the theater? It would be like you were watching them live. So I'm sorry but we do have access to them later. But it's not the same as seeing that activity in the moment. And that's what sport does for us. Sport takes that moment and makes it eternal.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. So which fights was your earliest memory that you saw?
Well, these were the early black fighters. I mean, those were the fights. I mean, of course, I saw the Muhammad Ali fights, live as they were going on, and that was a huge period for fights, a really glorious period. But I recall seeing these early fights on television, and the reason that I know I saw these early fights is because I remember the stories that my father told, but I remembered the ring cards, the black and white ring cards. Sometimes you can see those ring cards, the round cards, the ring round cards where you see a number 2 that for the second round, or a number 5, and they were swinging from the ropes. So as a young girl, obviously that's how I knew that this was the second round of, say, a Joe Gans fight, or a Jack Johnson later when they came on. But it was the stories that my father told me about these early fighters. And so, and I'm sorry I'm getting so involved in the passion of boxing, but I've had to fight all these years, not from the fans, not from the boxing fans. If you're a fan, you don't need any convincing. But it's the other people that may think, boxing is a violent sport, that we're promoting something that shouldn't be promoted. The boxers faced that all the way back to the early reformers of the 1890s. They were still fighting those old arguments, let's shut boxing down. But people don't realize how much, what the beauty of boxing is, and that's really what fascinates me. And yes, my father died of pugilistic dementia because of the battering he took, and he didn't fight that long, but he fought to make money. Can I tell a bit of his story? Nobody's heard my father's story. But
go ahead. I'm actually all ears, and I'm actually very interested about your father and his pugilage and in these days of fighting. Go ahead.
Well, so my father fought in, like I said, the early 30s, in the 30s. I'm talking about 30 through 32. And he fought in South Texas. But here's his story. My father was born in Mississippi in a small town that you and I wouldn't even call a town today. And it's now that town is taken over by Tupelo, Mississippi. So, Tupelo, Elvis Presley, that sort of thing. But my father was born there in 1913, Friday the 13th, November 13, 1913.
Okay.
And it was a lucky day, I always say. But regardless, they were so afraid of giving somebody that kind of a tarnish to their date that they signed his birth certificate as November 14th, but he was actually born on the 13th. But that shows you those, those little fetishes, those little fears that they had.
Yeah.
Regardless, my father cut wood. His father, I don't want to say anything bad about my family because some of my extended family may be listening, but regardless, the boys had to do most of the work. There was a lot going on, and, if you had these young kids, they could do the work for you, but it was the Depression, or it was always the Depression in Mississippi. I don't care if the stock market hadn't crashed by 1929, but these were the earlier days, and my father cut railroad ties, big, long, heavy railroad ties from the timber they had, and he got 1 penny apiece.
Wow.
Yes.
But that was the current rate, I guess, at that time, right?
Well, it was for these little guys. And in so doing, he had his hand, he was chopping and working on one with an axe, and he had his hand over the log, and he accidentally cut off his thumb.
Wow.
Well, he cut the tip of it off, but they had, no, medicine was primitive then, certainly no access. But by the time they got my dad to a doctor, gangrene had set in, and the doctor had to cut off the rest of the thumb down to the nub, so he really did not have a thumb. Now, here was my dad, who was a boxer, and I would say, Dad, how could you box without a left thumb? So I will tell all of your viewers, you make a grip. EJ, I hope you're doing this right now with your left hand.
I'm actually picturing the thing you're saying. Go ahead.
Now, you make a grip with your left hand, and you know how important for an orthodox fighter a left jab is.
Yeah.
Now, you make a fist, and you don't have that left thumb. Does that put you at any disadvantage? Well, my father's answer to that was always, now, I don't think I could throw a punch without my left thumb. But my father said, you don't need a left thumb to box. You don't need a thumb to box. Guess what? That was the advice he gave me all through life. Well, you know what? You don't need that to do this. I mean, could you imagine a greater person with greater advice? To me, so I grew up always thinking, well, I don't need that to do this. you know, these boxers, that's the kind of wisdom these boxers had, and they didn't let anything get in their way.
Wow.
So now let's go back to the beginning of boxing. My grandfather put the two oldest boys, my father and his older brother, who was two years older, on a train, and they went down to South Texas from Mississippi because they heard that the land was being developed for orchards, and that maybe they could use these boys in picking, you know, whatever fruit. And we're talking about manual labor. Well, my grandfather ended up bringing the whole family down there to the valley, to Edinburgh and far San Juan Alamo, Donna area, along the Rio Grande Valley that borders Mexico and Texas. When the family decided that they were going to pick up and move, guess what? They left my dad and his brother there. So my dad was 14 and 16. You know what? In those days, you were a man at 14. So that's what I love about my dad. Formed for me this transition between these early boxers and the later ones. All of those boxers were men, and most of them were on their own or left home by the age of 14. I have two sons. I can't imagine leaving my sons left alone to fend and forage during a depression when they're 14 and 16. But you know what? That trained you to be the man that you were. So my father then, he was trying to survive high school. He was living on a dairy farm, and for his room and board, he had to milk the cows at 4 o'clock, and he tried to go to high school. But that was virtually very difficult. And so he saw that day in 1930, 1929, 28, there was a boxing ring on every corner of Main Street, USA. And on the weekends, men would throw coins in, and people would challenge to be able to go get those coins. And of course, the bigger fighters got more coins and so on and so forth. Well, my father wanted shoes. He needed shoes. He had no shoes. And he saw the most expensive pair of shoes in the store window at $5. My father eventually developed a shoe fetish, and he always wore the most expensive shoes. But I know it came from that moment when he had to step in that ring with no experience, and he was going to win that money because he needed shoes. And he won the $5. He bought the shoes, and he was a boxer after that. But, you know, with that story, okay, now I know what these boxers were going through at the turn of the century. And then hearing the stories from my father, you know, it was just a texture that I could understand about these early fighters. So enough of my father, but isn't that the story of most of the boxers that come through? They're penniless, they're motivated, they want to win. It's a one-on-one challenge. It's not a team sport, and you can make some. And I owe everything that I am today, and that my family has, certainly to my father. And you know, I hope that the children of the boxers that we have today really appreciate what their fathers have and their mothers now have done for them to give them that kind of background. But having a boxer for a father, let me tell you, there were no excuses around our house.
Wow. And
there was no fear. So as a woman fighting all that, the first that I had to come through in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and being a woman out in the workforce, you know, my father said, it was his famous saying, and of course now with Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield, I can't say this anymore, but my father I would say, oh, Dad, I'm so afraid. I don't want to, I can't do that because, I'm so nervous. And he would always say, you know, get up in front of that crowd. What can they do? They can't eat you. And it was just a funny saying, but he always said it. What can they do? They can't eat you. Well, the world is a little bit different now, and but it certainly gave me the fearlessness, the fact that I grew up with that kind of background. And all the boxers that I talked to, they are such gentlemen. The older boxers, let me tell you, there's not a finer man than a retired boxer. You know, EJ, put me in a group of boxers any day. I will put those boxers, I don't care who they are, what their background is, they are better men than anybody I've seen today. I don't care, hands down. I'm sorry, that's how I feel about the old boxers. They're gentlemen. They've been through it. They've been in the ring. They know what it's like to win and lose. They know how, and you know what? Those men have done it all in their early period of their lives. They've learned lessons that most of us don't learn with a lifetime of living.
Yeah.
And that's why boxing is important for us, to train these young kids. Train these young kids in the art and grace of boxing, because maybe one day they will attain that grace.
I agree. I agree. Wow. Yeah, wow. I mean, the stuff you were saying, you know, I was actually picturing the turn of the century and what your dad, and you like your dad mentioned to you about what could the worst thing it can do is eat you, and and you're right about, because I interview a lot of old fighters, and they've been through experiences early in their life that some people haven't experienced in a lifetime, and then you're right, and I agree with you. Everything you're saying, I 100% agree with you.
So let's go back to the early boxers, and because I know that's what you want to talk about.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the specific things that they engaged in that we don't see today. And I'll start with the caveat that and I don't want to leave out my co-writer Mark Scott. We were in business together in Texas early on, and we shared the passion of boxing. And we were both writers at the time. We went on to live our lives, but we always connected. And Mark went through those early days when he was a young boxer, and he didn't have anything either. So I want to give a shout out to Mark Scott, because we just share so many things, obviously, about the history of boxing, and he knew many of the people that my father knew and that I knew in South Texas at the time, because he boxed in the Golden Gloves in Austin, and went down to South Texas and fought all the Ayalas, and they were a famous family. But let's go back to the turn of the century, and the caveat that I was going to mention was that when we first started writing about boxing, we got a great deal of criticism by saying that the old boxers people were saying that we were saying they were better than the modern boxers. Well, I'm not saying that they were better. I'm saying that you put one of those old boxers in the ring with some of the new boxers, and let's see what would happen. Those boxers, they knew that if they made the professionals, their average fight was going to be 20 rounds. I'm talking about their average fight. To go the distance, to turn pro. Now, yes, you could get some 10-round fights. Some people would only negotiate with these. Certainly the early black boxers were so tremendous that some of the white boxers at that time would only go 10 rounds with them. But for the most part, they knew that they were going to have to go 20 rounds. Now, at the time that I'm talking about, the early gloved boxers, and I'm talking about the 1890s through the 1910s, that they were going to have to go a finish fight, 45 rounds.
Oh, gosh. 45 rounds.
I invite any of your boxing viewers to train for 45-round fights. Can you imagine that?
I don't think that. I don't know. I'm not too sure. I don't know how many of them do 45. I hear a couple of them do 20, but I don't know about 45. I don't think so.
Think about it. How long a fight would that be? We're talking, yes, gloved boxing with gloves. The gloves weren't probably as sophisticated as they are today, because you had horsehair. Now, put your hand in a horsehair glove and think about what you can do once you're in that glove for so many rounds. The sweat, the blood. I mean, your gloves are going to be virtually soggy by the end of, a 40-round fight. How long is that? 3 minutes? 1 minute rest? You're going to go all afternoon. You're going to go 3 hours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And those weren't the longest fights. We have glove boxers that went 75 rounds.
75 rounds? Oh, how was it normal 3-minute rounds? And how did it work if you got knocked down? When you got knocked down, did you get a chance to rest? How did it work? Colleen? Hello? Oh.
Oh, the bottom line is that these men would fight, all day. Sometimes, have to come back. But those were very few fights, I will tell you, because that was in the transition from bare knuckle to gloved. But there are some long fights, only because the bare knuckle fights were used to fighting. But those rules were different. In bare knuckle, when you were down, that ended the round, and then you can't get 30 seconds to get back up and go to scratch. But today, still in the 1890s, when the black fighters that I write about, and the early other fighters, they went regular 3-minute rounds, 1-minute rest break. But let's talk about some of the different strategies that they had that might be different from what you would expect to see today, and what you can see in some of those old footages still. There are a couple of boxers that I like to mention. The one that is a particular favorite of mine, only because he was such a dirty fighter. I like fair fights, but he was George McFadden, and his boxing moniker was Elbows. George Elbows McFadden. Now, that sounds like an interesting fighting approach, doesn't it?
Yeah. Why would you think why they call him Elbows, eh?
There you go. Well, the reason is that he loved boxing. He started out of New Jersey, and he broke his hand, his right hand, in a boxing match, and it didn't heal very well. Now, okay, that's the other difference. One of the main differences is, think about the medicine and the practices you had then. I mean, virtually, they weren't setting bones like they do today, or pinning with specialized orthopedic surgeons. Your hand, you had to wait till your hand healed. Who knows how it was going to heal? But regardless, Elbows McFadden had a broken hand for 2 years, but he still wanted to get in the ring and fight. So he realized that he didn't have to use his fist. This is like my father not having a thumb. He realized that he didn't have to use his fist. He could fight with his elbow. Now, granted, you wouldn't do that today, but he was one, at least the early authorities, the Nat Fleischers of those days, that would have been Richard K. Fox, the publisher of the Police Gazette. But he thought that Elbows McFadden was one of the greatest defensive boxers of that period. I say of all time, but they're talking about until 1910. Well, I have his little book that he published in 1905, and it was How to Be a Good Defensive Boxer. Well, that I thought, okay, well, if he was supposed to be one of the best defensive boxers, because I always believed that the boxers that I wrote about, people like Joe Gans and Dixon and Walcott, I thought those guys were the best defensive fighters. And let me tell you why I think the early black fighters had to be the best defensive fighters. Because in America at that time, we are still, so the division of the black versus the white was still so strong. And would it have been to the black fighters' advantage to have gone in there pell-mell the first round and bloodied the white opponent and knocked him down and killed him? I mean, what would have happened to the majority of black boxers if that had happened?
I don't think the fight would have continued. I think they would have probably looked to lynch him or something like that. Of
course. And how many of them were threatened with lynchings? They were all threatened with, they all had death threats or lynchings. Now, it wasn't every fight, I'll tell you, but in their lifetimes, they certainly were facing that. So yes, the only way that you could become a good fighter and get good fights were to be a good defensive fighter. So that's why they had to let their opponents go, whatever, and certainly they were written in the Articles of Agreement. Most of these guys wouldn't fight these early black fighters without something in the contract saying, okay, we'll let him go 5 rounds. You have to make him look good 5 rounds. Okay, you have to have 6 rounds. Certainly when the early fights were being filmed, they didn't want to knock out in the first round. They wanted to show the film later. So they had to let him go. 8 rounds was the perfect film length And you'll see, if you can go pull up Joe Gans and Kid Herman, you'll see that that was one of the most popular fights of its time. And that was 1907. It was shown everywhere for 2 years. And they were making money in the theaters with that fight. This was a perfect fight. Joe Gans let him go 8 rounds, and then he knocked him out with the most killer knockout you have ever seen. And it was always mentioned to be the best knockout of its time. So those guys were good defensive fighters. Yes, you can see all of their great defensive moves. But let me go back. I'm not going to forget about George Elbows McFadden.
Yeah.
So what were his tactics and how were they different? And some of these tactics you can still see today. And what he believed was you could strike somebody defensively with your elbow. Now I say strike because they're coming in. You just happen to have your elbow in the way.
Yeah.
And that's how you could become a good defensive fighter with your elbow. Now, but if you look at his book, oh my gosh, EJ, some of these tactics you couldn't believe today, like how to grab somebody and, really we're talking about breaking their arms.
Yeah.
Or breaking their wrists.
Wow.
These were the goals in those days as a good, quote, defensive fighter. Certainly to pull his elbow back around, how to get your opponent's elbow around his back so you could dislocate his shoulder.
Wow.
Now, those were strategies taught in the ring. So, that's a little bit different from, we might learn those strategies on the street, but we're probably not going to learn those in the ring.
Yeah. Mike Tyson and Floyd have been known for, people said they use their elbows. So, obviously Mike Tyson, he studied all the old-time fighters. I think a lot of time when he threw his hooks, he would follow up with the elbow, but that wasn't necessarily a defensive tactic of someone advances onto you. And with Floyd Mayweather, he uses it in a defensive posture with his elbow as well, when he uses it as a leverage. So I can actually picture what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah, using. And
sometimes you could see that really they're using what you may think is their elbow is really their forearm.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's always there, and you have to have a strong forearm, and you train for that. But that elbow gives you that certain advantage there.
Yeah, definitely. Well, he's first defensive fighter. So what's his name? George Elbow McFadden.
That's it.
I'm going to look him up after this interview. I'm going to look him up. You fight fans, you do it as well. We're getting a history lesson here. You continue, Colleen. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I love Mike Tyson. So let me go back to my love of Mike Tyson.
Okay, go ahead.
I loved Mike Tyson when he was going through a very difficult period in his life. And it was very difficult when I would say a positive word about Mike Tyson because he had all these other social things going on. And listen, I'm not here to excuse any kind of bad behavior in public. I don't care what it is. I don't care. You need to control yourself. That because you are a fighter. A fighter has to take more from the public. He really does. Ask all of these fighters. You're expected to be, because you're in the public light, yes, you are expected to do things as a gentleman, because you know what? You can kill them in the ring anytime you want. But so anyway, let me go back to why I love Mike Tyson, because when I was working on the Joe Gans book, back in that book was published in 2008. And so when I was doing the research in Baltimore for that, I had to go search out his grave. By the way, in 2005, 2006, 2007, there was no one on the street that even knew who Joe Gans was. Yeah. I'm very proud that today almost everybody knows who Joe Gans was.
Yeah.
But there was no one there. When my husband and I drove to the graveyard, Mount Auburn Cemetery, to locate his grave, we pulled up. The thing was in chains. It was awful. Here was this very historic American cemetery with the greatest people, not just Joe Gans buried prominently in the front there, but great people of early history. We should have revered that graveyard, but here it was in shambles. It was chained. Well, there was a policeman parked right in front of what looked like the projects at the time, and so the policeman, I went up to him and I said to this policeman, I'm going to go over those chains, and I just want to tell you what I'm doing. See, you never can say. Is it okay for me to go over it? Because I was afraid he would tell me no. And I was determined to find Joe Gans' grave.
Yeah.
Well, so anyway, he looked at me like, well, you're crazy if you want to go, in that graveyard. But I said, I'm going to go over there. I just want to let you know, because I didn't want to be arrested, quite honestly, for trespassing. And so I said, and he said, well, what are you looking for? And I said, I am looking for the grave of the magnificent Joe Gans. And he looked at me and I said, have you ever heard of Joe Gans? And he said, no, he never had. So I proceeded to give him a quick boxing lesson, or a boxing history lesson. But isn't that a shame? But I'm not putting him down. I'm just saying that was the sign of the times. That you have a man who is literally there guarding that area every minute, of his shift. And within eye distance, here was a great man buried whose grave we ought to revere again for all time. And that was very sad for me. But regardless, I hopped over and photographed the grave, and then found the two old boxers that were trying to keep that grave, and they are friends of mine to this day, and I cherish that memory. But it was very difficult in those days to find anything about Joe Gans, and of course you had to throw yourself in a library in the dungeons and look through old newspaper clippings. And today it's so wonderful because more and more things are coming online, and people have access to these early research tools, and I think that's wonderful. But anyway,
I agree with Steve Lott. I interviewed Steve Lott, and he's Bill Caton had the fight, Bill Caton and Jim Jacobs, and he's the biggest library of the fight films. And obviously, Bill Caton died, and Steve Lott took over that, and he gave the rights to ESPN for Muhammad Ali, Joe Louis, and all the big names. But for all the other fighters, he has all the fight film with them, and he's currently the fight of the day, promoting old time fights for all the guys who love all the old time fighters. So it's a current theme at the minute. The guys fight.
Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful? I think I love that. And Steve Lott has been so gracious to me to provide pictures and things for my books, and and making sure that Mike Tyson, got a copy of Joe Gans. So, so here was how I'm an old lady. I have to, you have to be prodded back to my subject here. But when I heard that Mike Tyson visited that grave, you know what? I was in love with Mike Tyson. If Mike Tyson wanted to visit the grave of Joe Gans, a fighter who I so admire, and then you know what? Mike Tyson couldn't do anything bad in my book.
No, yeah, a lot of people feel the same way. I mean, people are still in love with Mike Tyson up until now. I mean, what he did in the ring was reminiscent of some of them old time fighters. Jack Dempsey.
Yeah, exactly. Where did he learn
it? Yeah, excitement.
Where did he learn it? And thank heavens that Customato showed him those old films.
Yeah.
And he was trained on those old films. And Tyson is a great historian. You should interview him.
Well, he's not allowed in London at the minute because they changed the laws. Anyone with a criminal record can't come into England no more, so they wouldn't allow him in. I don't think they can allow Floyd Mayweather in because he recently has a criminal record as well. So unless they change the laws, which if they just put implemented in December, I don't think England's gonna be able to see Mike Tyson. We'd have to go to the States.
Wow.
And Australia has the same thing as well because they prevented Mike Tyson going there. So The only way we can do it is online, and and this is another thing about the internet, and obviously with social media allowed me to obviously contact you and contact Steve Lott and other people that are there. So the world has become a bit smaller by the internet, but we're allowed to see all this fight footage. And with the Joe Gans, because you're right about 97, 2000, people didn't know about Joe Gans, and Mike Tyson was prominent about that. Even with Muhammad Ali at the time, I know I found out about he imitated Ray Robinson's style, but with Mike Tyson especially, he talked about all the old time fighters and watched them, and all the old
absolutely.
So he kept the old fighters alive for anyone who's willing to go and watch, and that's all I watch at the minute. All I watch is old fighters, black and white fighters. That's as much as I can get, as much as I can talk about it and see it. I'll watch it, but the turn of the century to me is still a thing. And only recently I heard about Tiger Flowers, and he went through, and and especially with you and Al Bernstein talking about the Carnival champions and all the old fighters, Joe Gans and Sam Lanford and all the old guys. These are stuff that people talk about, but I know you've got detailed research. The stuff you've just mentioned so far at the interview is that you could actually picture what you said about the horse. Was it horse? What was the gloves made of? Them times it was finger.
Yes, horsehair.
Your horsehair, like how horsehair is very thin. So
yes.
So that your knuckles must have been in serious pain.
Yes. So what you would do is during the fight, what you were trying to do is you would move the horsehair around so that you could get, your knuckles could get better leverage there. Painful.
It's very painful. And also we talk about fighters we know about in England. We talk about Molyneux, and is it Molyneux? He came over from America to face what's his name? Thingy Kreb. He came over, and and how they broke his arm in the fight. So when you're mentioning about how black fighters had to be defensive, I could actually picture that, because they done a documentary about it as the first time. Obviously they mentioned him as the first black champion, but he's not recognized as the champion. Yes. And what he went through and how they broke his arm because they didn't want him to lose. They didn't.
Absolutely.
And absolutely. I mean, the fight. What fighters had to endure just to go through, it's amazing what they went through.
Yes, and look at it. Look what. Did they wear any mouthpieces? And look, they still take pictures with their teeth.
Yeah. I think so. I heard they used to take orange peel. Used to put in their mouth as mouthpieces. And Colleen, what I wanted to discuss with you is the turf, because you look like some of the fights were pictured in like a farm kind of rural area. Like it was the ring itself was square, and it was like fences, and it looked like the surface was like dirt.
Yes.
John L. Sullivan. It looked like barbaric.
Well, remember the difference between the bare knuckle fights and the glove fights. Really, those rules were spelled out really in the Queensberry rules. But in the bare knuckle fights, when you would wear cleats, you would have like baseball cleats, but they would be sharp. I guess they would be sharper than what's allowed today. But why you needed your second there was because if you were able to get a break, they would go claw the turf from your cleats, and sometimes little mountains would build up of dirt and grass from just pulling it off of their cleats in the corner there.
What's cleats? What's cleats, Clean?
Cleats are spikes on your shoes.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's what you call it. Okay, yeah, all right, yeah. Oh, wow.
So also thinking you're wearing spiked shoes.
Yeah.
So you can cleat what we call cleat somebody. You can spike somebody with your shoes. I mean, it was rugged in those days.
Yeah, definitely. I'm actually picturing John L. Sullivan. I remember he was wearing, they used to wear kind of like stockings and shorts, and I'm actually remembering them kind of wearing little spikes on their shoes to get the grip from the dirt.
Absolutely.
Okay. So you see, these are the gaps. So I can picture now. So and he was there, but John L. Sullivan was considered to be a very formidable guy. I mean, he beat Paddy Ryan, right?
Yes. Well, John L. Sullivan was a hero, and people still wanted when when he lost the fight to Corbett in the Carnival of Champions in 1892 in New Orleans, it was a big disappointment, really, because people wanted him. Well, it was an exciting fight, and a new scientific man took over. Corbett was from San Francisco. He was a gentleman. His moniker was Gentleman Jim Corbett, and so he was different from the rugged Sullivan who would go around and throw challenges to everybody and say, I'll kick your ass and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And so there were different style of fighters. But certainly when you get into the ring, yes, you have glove fighters fighting. I'm going to go back to what you said. Yes, it looked like they're still fighting on the farms. Well, when you were coming up, and you were learning to fight in the early fights. I'm talking about glove fights. And let's talk about the gloves for a second. The first gloves that they used were just like gloves that you would put on today. They were more like driving gloves. If you can picture the people in their old cars with little gloves on to be able to hold the steering wheel still. They were skin tight gloves. And those were the gloves that they were using in the practice, in the rings, in the gyms to practice with. But then later, the 2-ounce gloves came in, and people were boxing with 2-ounce gloves. But I want to make it clear to your viewers, this is the first time I've been able to say this. I'm not sure that I've written about this, but I've gotten some criticism about the fact that Joe Gans wore 5-ounce gloves into his fight with Nelson, because people thought they were 6-ounce gloves. So let me tell you, people are fanatic about their boxing history. But the reason that Joe Gans wore 5-ounce gloves, because the lightweights considered really almost into what we would call the middleweights today, they all wore 5-ounce gloves. The heavies wore 6-ounce gloves. So that is the distinction in the period of time that I'm talking about, 1890s to 1910. The lighter weights wore 5-ounce gloves, and the heavies wore 6-ounce gloves. So that's the distinction there in gloves. And of course, the gloves were made differently. They were primarily horsehair stuffed at that time. You will find some gloves that are stuffed with wood chips as well, wood shavings. And those gloves go into the 30s. You'll still find gloves in the 30s with wood shavings in them.
Well, they were talking about Jack Dempsey when he fought Jeff Willard. How they had something in the glove. The gloves were loaded. Do you know anything about that?
I don't believe that those gloves were loaded. I just absolutely do not believe it. I know there's a considerable controversy, and I'm not going to solve that controversy. But just personally, I don't believe that, because there were representatives from the other side watching the gloves put on, and I just don't believe that if you had somebody from the other side and you saw something suspicious. Now, could they have traded them out? I don't know. I don't believe that. Let me tell you, Dempsey was a formidable puncher. And I don't personally. I just don't believe that those gloves were loaded. But could they have been? And there's so much going on, and the fights were so frequently. When I talk about fixed fights, sometimes I don't mean that fixed for the outcome. Certainly, the outcomes were fixed. But there's so many concessions that had to be made in those fights during the fight that when you talk about fixed fights, yes. If you have to let somebody go 5 rounds to look good, they could do quite a bit of damage to you, can't they, in those 5 rounds?
Yeah, definitely. Look, you mentioned about Joe Gans. When you talk about Al Bernstein, about how Joe Gans, he got headbutted in his face and his eye was popping out, but he had to continue fighting. Go into that a bit?
Yes, that was a 1900 fight, and that he was absolutely criticized for quitting. A fighter can't quit. Still to this day, if you're a quitter, that's not a good. Yeah.
Yesterday.
Wow, we haven't talked about that one either, have we?
No. He quit. He was. I interviewed Louis Cordaz. I believed he was going to win already because he had more skills. And all Victor Ortiz had was power. And but quitting. People don't forgive quitters. Like Roberto Duran. That's what they hold on to.
That's true. Yes, yes. And, I say poor Victor, he was knocked down, but I mean, boy, he's looking to get under those ropes, wasn't he?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think he won anymore. I think his jaw, what Floyd did to him in that fight where he hit his jaw, I don't think he was ever the same. I think he's...
Exactly. Well, he was, the direction he was coming into with that jaw, and then, to take the right hook like that,
It was bad.
It was tremendous, yeah.
Yeah, he looked like he was in tremendous pain.
Yeah. So he thought he was down enough, but he was still getting hit on the head. So he stuck his...
You know what? People were so cruel that they say they should have got up anyway.
Okay, so let's talk about Joe Gans.
Yeah,
so Joe Gans is in that fight, and so he gets hit. He gets headbutted. He gets hit. Again, you don't let up. I mean, first of all, there are no doctors in the ring that are going to stop anything.
Yeah.
You have to remember that. There are no doctors.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to stop a fight until that fighter is down, out, over with, down. And you know what? At that time, there wasn't a 3-down rule. There wasn't a neutral corner. When that knee came up, you were fair game, and your opponent was standing there over you, ready to knock you down again.
Yeah.
Because you had to stay down to be down. So, yes, his eye was ripped open, and you can see the horrible gash in later pictures of the scar from that fight. I mean, normally he had a relatively unmarked face for having gone through, as many fights as he did, to over 200 fights. But his eye was, I believe, knocked literally, I think it was torn open so that it looked like it was out of his socket. And the referee demanded that he continue fighting.
Mm-hmm. Who was the guy he was fighting at the time?
That was Frank Ern.
Wow, that's terrible.
Yeah. And people said Frank Ern wasn't a great fighter. Well, let me tell you, you don't win from Levine if you're not a great fighter. So, I think the problem is to be able to determine whether or not you're a great fighter. You have to look at all of the fights and their setups and who won. But also, I think you have to look at the footage.
I agree.
And you don't have a lot of footage from those early fights, so it's difficult to say who was really great and who wasn't.
Yeah.
But I mean, but still, on the whole, granted, there were many fighters that fought hundreds of fights, and many white fighters. But if you look at the black fighters and their records, they were fighting twice, 3 times, more fights. They were fighting once a week, certainly once a month. They weren't fighting once a year like some of the fighters that came later on.
Yeah. Can you go into the Carnival Champions? Because I don't know nothing about that. I didn't know how that was conceived, and what was a circus, and tell us a bit about that.
Well, I write quite a bit about the carnivals, the boxing carnivals, and Mark and I cover that in, I think we do that in the Rickard book.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time on the Carnival of Champions, or those early carnivals. But basically, there were a group of promoters in New Orleans who wanted, and New Orleans was a hot fighting town. New Orleans in those days, many of the places on the East Coast, Louisville, Chicago, San Francisco to a certain extent, but San Francisco got bigger. The fights were bigger later on. But certainly in 1892, glove boxing was the rage, and this was the first gloved carnival where you had championship caliber fighters coming into the ring to fight. So there were 3 main fights. There was a lightweight, featherweight, and the heavyweight. The biggest draw was, of course, the heavyweight championship was going to be determined with gloves between John L. Sullivan and gentleman Jim Corbett. And Corbett, and again, the money that was exchanged in the hands for the title fights, that was a title fight, and that was a winner-take-all of $25,000.
in them days, it's quite a bit.
We're talking about 1892.
Yeah.
And again, the comparisons of what you could buy. And I told Al Bernstein, when the again, these are the high price tickets, but when a reserve seat costs $15, and the average monthly salary of a worker monthly salary was $20. I mean, you're spending a lot of money to get a reserve seat.
Yeah.
What I like about that, and again, it was a carnival, and because this was a huge event, it was your big entertainment, and they wanted that boxing carnival to be as big and famous as Carnival or Mardi Gras in New Orleans, and that was the kind of. I want you to get, and your listeners to get the impression that these were huge boxing events as entertainment. You didn't have other entertainment. And as a matter of fact, before the 1890s, unless you were extremely wealthy and you didn't have to work for a living, you didn't have entertainment because you were working 6 or 7 days a week. And the average workday at that time was 10 to 12 hours a day.
Wow.
So not only were you working hard, you were working all the time. And the reason we call holidays and why they were so special was because you didn't have to work that day.
Yeah.
It was a holy day. And so the holidays were, and that's why you see in the early fights, the huge championship fights were usually around holidays. They were around the Christmas, they were New Year's Day fights, they were Labor Day fights, the September fights, Labor Day fights. 4th of July was huge in America. Those were big fights during those days. But back to the championship in 1892, what was so interesting, I think, for historical purposes is to see what happened with the George Dixon fight in Skelly. Well, I probably speak too lightly in my books of Skelly because I think I say he was really barely more than an amateur. He had fought fights, but he was no George Dixon. So if you were a betting person and you were going into that fight, you would certainly bet on George Dixon. But think about it, you really didn't, because I know this is going to sound amazing to everyone, but it's certainly, I mean, even when you're starting the research, you can't even believe what you're reading. You can't believe this, but some people in those days thought that just the sight of an African American fighter in the ring, you would drop dead to see a white man in the ring up against you. Those were the preconceptions of much of the general public, that just by seeing a white man in the ring, you would drop to your knees, you'd turn to, putty. You just couldn't stand up to that. So, I mean, with that kind of background in the minds of the general white Americans, it was phenomenal. They couldn't believe that these black men were winning all these matches. They could not believe it. How can this happen? How can this happen?
Yeah.
Trust me, George Dixon, in an article that I just recently got off a couple of days ago, I called George Dixon the American Napoleon. He was a little guy, and these guys, and that's the other thing, most of these fighters, the average man was 5'2", weighed 125 pounds. So,
5'2".
Average man
was 5'2".
And weighed about 125 pounds in those days. Anywhere from 5'2" to 5'4". People didn't have the luxury of a lot of food. They didn't have the luxury of, they built up tremendous muscles. When you see Joe Walcott at, 5 foot, these guys were short, but they were power packed, power loaded.
Joe Walcott, not Josie Joe Walcott, the original Jersey Joe, the original Walcott. Which Walcott was that?
Original Joe Walcott was from the West Indies, and he came over and he trained under George Dixon, and he was the first to win. He was the first a fighter of African descent to win the welterweight title in 1901.
Oh man!
And these were guys, they all knew each other. It was a band of brothers. If there was ever a band of brothers in those days, those were the early black champions. Joe Gans, George Dixon, Jack Skelly. He's another guy that I dearly love. He was the Tommy Skelly, the Harlem Spider. Isn't that just a great name? The Harlem Spider.
Oh, Harlem Spider. Oh, wow. Hey, I've never heard of that guy before.
I know. It's just, but yet he fought all of these guys. I mean, they were all friends. It was just, I just want to go back in that time and sit in a couple of those gyms and hear those men talk. I mean, it fascinates me. It really fascinates me.
Was it for the three aces? I remember you talking about the three aces, but there was supposed to be four because they didn't match Jack.
I didn't. I said there were supposed to be four. I think there should have been four. Yeah. That Fleischer didn't want four, but anyway.
So for the people listening, so who were the three aces?
The three aces were George Dixon, who was the first bantam and featherweight champion. He was actually born in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Canada. So really, Canada can claim him, even though he fought all of his really professional fights really in America. But George Dixon, he won that in 1890 and 1891. And the second was Walcott, Joe Walcott, who, again, from the West Indies originally, and landed in Boston and fought. Boston was the hotbed for all the fighters. That's John L. Sullivan, the Boston Strong Boy, and he trained with the same manager, Tom O'Rourke, as George Dixon. And so then the third ace was Joe Gans. Now Joe Gans was a little bit farther south from Baltimore, and his manager was Hereford. And so when the Dixon and Walcott, again having the same manager, Tom O'Rourke, that kept them in a very close-knit group. But certainly they all trained, and they were all in that geographical location of Philadelphia, Baltimore, around that centralized D.C. area up to Boston. And so it was a tight-knit group. In New Jersey, a lot of good fighters coming out of New Jersey at that time as well. But certainly they all won titles. These were the champions. And, really truly, of that period, you don't really remember the other champions. You simply remember George Dixon, Joe Walcott, 1901, Joe Gans, 1902, and then Jack Johnson, 1908. So for me, that was just a really divine period. I think that's why, certainly the fighters, certainly in my father's period of the 30s, why they so wanted to learn anything and everything from the black fighters, because they were considered the greatest at that time. You don't have any other big fighters coming along until Joe Louis, and then Joe Louis, certainly all of those, even Muhammad Ali tipped his hat to all of those, the aces, and they were tremendous.
What do you know about the Tiger Flowers then?
Tiger Flowers, again, I didn't focus on Tiger Flowers and the Black Champions. I tried to get someone to write on that. But we didn't. But they're just, I'll save that for your. You have someone writing a book, and I think you should interview them on Tiger Flowers. I think all of those guys were great. I mean, I'm telling you, they were just tremendous. They were just tremendous. And why am I so excited about them? Is because they had to fight defensively. They obviously had to fight offensively because they had to win. And they were just great technicians. You will not find, even in Tiger Flowers, better technicians. Obviously
the fighters in the 50s, they took from there. I mean, I'm sure Sugar Ray Robinson, I don't know who he looked up to, but I'm sure they took things from all the fighters in the past days. Obviously Joe Gans, people talk about people like what's his name again, the one who Sugar Ray Robinson was supposed to fight, but he didn't fight him. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Wills.
Is it no, not Wills?
No, not Wills. I'm sorry, that's earlier.
Sugar Robertson. They said the only guy that he didn't want to fight.
Right.
Yeah.
It'll come to me.
Yeah,
It'll come to me.
yeah. All them great.
But Floyd Patterson. I mean, look, Patterson. All of them. They took, and that's why Tyson watched
Charlie Burley. That's his name, Charlie Burley.
Oh, Burley. Charlie Burley.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, go ahead.
But even though Tyson, they were watching Patterson fights, Patterson taking from these early fighters.
Yeah.
Well, look who Joe Louis was trained by, Chappie.
Who's that?
Jack Blackburn.
Oh, really? He was trained by Sam Bradford?
Jack Blackburn. And Jack Blackburn, his whole mission was to fight and win and beat Joe Gans. I mean, he fought him, I think, 5 times.
Really?
Probably.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so and Jack Blackburn tried to get Joe Louis to fight like Joe Gans. I mean, he just didn't have the same footwork, and he was always trying to teach Joe Louis the steps of Joe Gans.
I didn't know that. You know when I think of, because I saw the footage you're talking about Joe Gans when he went 8 rounds and was allowed to go 8 rounds, and he knocked the guy out. I've seen that footage, and you're talking about the numbers were stuck on the ring rope. That's the footage I've actually seen. And when I actually think about Joe Gans now and Joe Louis, they had similar style. He used the jab and the right hand. Which other fighters you used to fight? Most fighters, they were quite brawlers. They used to fight hooks, and they never used to use their jab. Obviously, like Gentleman Jim Corbett, he obviously used his jab, and so did Gene Tunney. I actually saw the footage of Gentleman Jim Corbett teaching Tunney his tactics. I think he helped him a lot. Actually.
Yeah, is it exactly those Yes, that footage there. That's interesting. I think that's a great footage to look at. On those tactics. But don't get me wrong. Joe Gans used that left jab. He could keep anybody away from him with that left jab.
He had a very long reach, it looked like, when I saw that fight.
Yes, he did. Don't ask me to quote what that reach was.
It was long. Sure. It looked pretty long. It looked pretty long. It definitely looked long.
Yeah, I mean, that's why EJ. That's why if you look at that fight with Terry McGovern, that fixed fight in Terry McGovern, with Terry McGovern. If you look at that, that is so pathetic. First of all, I can't imagine Joe. That to me, I know Joe was hit, but let me tell you, he doesn't use that left jab to keep him away, and he could have. I mean, easily. He doesn't block Terry McGovern's punches at all.
Yeah, I haven't actually seen that one. I only saw the one when he knocked the guy out. I don't know which footage that was, but I haven't seen the Terry McGovern one where he got knocked out. I actually saw the one where he knocked out. I don't know the guy.
Kid Herman. Yeah,
that's the footage I've seen. I haven't seen the other one when he got knocked out, but I heard about the fix was in. But it's amazing that they went for like Wills. So would you? Wills. I don't know much about Wills. I think he was done by Jack Dempsey, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, Harry Wills, people think that he was avoided. He didn't get the fair shots. He probably didn't. I don't think any of the black fighters got really tremendous.
Murderer's Row, they call it. Murderer's Row.
Exactly. There you go. But who do they turn to when they need a historic, figure? Joe Louis. But anyway, Harry Wills, I'm going to be doing an interview with Al Bernstein, so I don't really want to get too much into the Tex Rickard book. No, I want to stick with the early black fighters. That's here. Right. The early, but Harry Wills certainly deserved a shot. I don't think. The reason Tex Rickard didn't put him in the title fight that he should have was because he previously lost a match. But we can go into that in more detail a little bit later.
That's all right. Yeah, that's all right. I mean, stick with the early century. We covered Jack Johnson and Sam Lamford. Let's maybe Sam Lamford. Go into Sam Lamford a bit. I mean.
Sam Langford, oh my goodness, you just can't find, the uncrowned champion. He really was. I mean, there wasn't anything he couldn't win. And, Joe Jeanette and Sam McVeigh.
Yeah, Sam McVeigh.
They were considered heroes in Paris. Long fights, and then obviously Jack Johnson. They don't get their due in fighting history, but let me tell you, these guys, they could put down anyone and be kings. Be kings. Yeah. There's another thing thing I want to mention on the social scene just is not directly related to boxing, but
Go ahead.
the fact that Jack Johnson was so maligned, with womanizing, and certainly with his white wives and so on and so forth. But you recall they were wives; they were his wives.
Yeah.
I'm sorry they were not whores. It's like Jack Dempsey. When people said to Jack Dempsey, "Why was your first wife a whore?" and he said, "Well, I'm boxing in saloons. Who was I expected to meet? A school teacher?"
It's true, isn't it? What did they expect?
Yeah, exactly. But people forget that the first black champion George Dixon was married to Tom O'Rourke, his manager's sister.
Oh, was it?
So there were many black-white relationships. Joe Gans had a consort who was white, and they had a child. So, but no one seemed to, I don't know why it was so polarizing in that Jack Johnson was perhaps, in your face all of the time. And certainly he had a right to be. I mean, he was the champion.
Yeah, so to see Jim Jeffries at the time, they talk about Jim Jeffries a bit. So
Jim Jeffries,
what kind of man was he? Because they said he was really, I saw him when he was past it, but people talk about Jim Jeffries, he's definitely one of the greatest of all time. We go into that a bit.
Jim Jeffries was a slugger like Dempsey. He came up much like Dempsey, but he was a slugger. He was compared later to the Brute. The original Brute that Jack London in literature talks about is Nelson, actually, who fought Gans, and they were just massive men who won by the strength of their fists, and went at people. I'm not suggesting that they had no style, but they were extremely powerful punchers. And Jim Jeffries, all of these old fighters, well, I say all of them, but the ones that were known for their walloping punches were either they threw axes. They were, they worked in meat factories. They worked as lumbermen.
Yeah.
These were heavy-duty slingers, and I'm telling you, their arms were tremendously powerful.
Yeah.
Jim Jeffries, simply, I think he just got tired of the fight game. But one thing, he could win all of his matches, and but he was also very demanding. He demanded. The reason why we don't see any more fights than we do from Jim Jeffries, he demanded winner-take-all pots. And at that time, it was very difficult to get fighters at that level who were willing to do. Think about it. You have to prepare.
Winner-take-all, that means like if you win, you get all the money, and the other guy doesn't get anything. No percentage.
That's correct.
No, that's not worth it.
That's right. So go back to the Carnival of Champions, 1892. Sullivan had a winner-take-all pot at $25,000. George Dixon, by the way, people don't know this. For the most part, George Dixon had a winner-take-all pot at $17,500.
Wow. He won?
Yes, of course, and that was a large pot. So the fallout from that fight was tremendous. The American public did not want any more title fights with a black man because they were afraid that the title would be kept, because they knew George Dixon was so darn good.
Yeah.
And George Dixon did keep that title for a long time.
Yeah.
So then now Jim Jeffries comes in. Jim Jeffries wins the title, and so he virtually is out of the ring, not wanting to fight. He's certainly retired by 1904.
Yeah.
But he didn't have the kind of draw that these other fighters did at that time, because everyone knew that Jim Jeffries could win. And his demands for the winner-take-all pot that kept other people from coming in. You had to put money down, and usually at this time it's about $5,000 to post money for a fight. Certainly before 1900, you didn't see any big fights posted for less than $1,000. That is so much money. I can't get across the point that was just so much money. So it put a lot of these fighters out of contention.
Yeah, at the time Jim Jeffries, when he was fighting, which black fighters was he ducking? I know it was Jack Johnson, obviously he finally got the ring, but apparently this is what they said, he retired because he didn't want to fight the black fight. Which other black fighters was it? Sam Ledford and McVeigh and all them other guys that he didn't want to fight at the time?
He wasn't going to fight any of them. And they were all good.
Yeah.
And that really started with Peter Jackson, the great Peter Jackson from Australia. When he came over to box.
Peter Jackson, was he a black guy?
Yes. Yes.
From Australia?
Yes, he was the Australian champion.
Aborigine?
No. He came off of a plantation. I'm forgetting where he grew up.
Probably from the West Indies or something.
Originally West Indies, yes, but he was just great. He was tremendous. And what I love about him, oh my gosh, his story is amazing. I don't want to get off on another tangent, but let me tell you about him. He comes to America, and this is what I love about talking to you. First of all, you're cute and your accent is absolutely adorable.
Oh,
how can anybody, that British accent is just amazing.
Oh, thank you.
So Peter Jackson has, the British or the mother tongue accent.
Okay.
So here he is, this man who's, I forget his exact height. I think he was almost 6 foot. Maybe he was 6 foot. But he comes over and he has the perfect physique. And he's intelligent, and he has the accent of the mother tongue.
Wow.
I mean, how could you not fall in love with this guy? Everybody immediately considered him more intelligent than anybody else.
Yeah.
And, I'm sorry, Americans, when they're around British people and they have that accent, they automatically assume they're more intelligent. So, anyway, Peter Jackson was a big hit. Now, the art community, I love this. The art community is going through this renaissance that I talk about from the early days of the Greek, it's this neoclassical period where everything Greek and Roman is now popular. So the artists, I'm sorry, my background in writing comes from some of the artists, but the artists of the day, when Peter Jackson came over, my God, they were so taken with him. He's put on a slab of marble and pictured, and the artists come around naked, by the way, and he's measured with what they call calipers, these little utensils, because the artists were measuring his muscles. They were posing him like the greatest Adonis of all time. And he was this champion. He was more Greek than the Greek statues of old time. Now, here is a boxer, and a black boxer, by the way, at that time, getting this kind of notoriety. I find it amazing that he was considered the best looking man in the world at that time. And his image appears in newspapers and drawn and by these artists who considered him, from Washington D.C., considered him the most artistic body of a man that could ever exist.
Wow. So now, he was pretty. Go ahead.
This is a Victorian era, mind you.
Okay.
Now, when you can print that this black man is more appealing and more artistically developed than any other man in the world, I think you have for me, I think that period was an opening in race relations that obviously, to a certain extent, got shut down a little bit by the white boxers of the time. And that really depresses me, because I think there was a period of time in race relations in the United States when people were open to the beauty of the best man, so to speak. But then certainly John L. Sullivan comes along, he draws the color line, and where really truly, I think in parlance, everybody everyday parlance, where does the color line come from? It's that scratch line in the sand. That boxer was not going to step over that line to be in the same ring with a black man. And come on. The reason is because they could beat them.
Yes. That's why.
The reason is because they could all beat them, and they know they would lose the title, which was so lucrative. And why were the titles in those days so lucrative? Not simply because they carried all this money, $20,000, $15,000, these championship fights, but because they could make more money on the road in exhibitions, in theaters at the time. They could make more money than they could in these championship fights. For example, if you could make $25,000, you could make, Jim Corbett and all of those men, they could make $70,000 on the road. That's a lot of money.
Yes, it is, isn't it? And you wonder why some of the, this is another thing about boxing that surprised me. You wonder how some of them was broke. John L. Sullivan, I think he ended up broke. Jack Johnson, a lot of them. You wonder where all that money went. Where did they all spend it?
It was high living. I hate to say that, but it was high living. But the cost. I was going to mention that. So if you were to go into a fight, what it would cost to go into a championship fight for both sides. Remember, you have training quarters. You have everyday living expenses. You have train fare. And when Joe Gans would go to a fight, or any of these, George Dixon or Jack Johnson, any of these fighters, you've virtually filled up a train car with your seconds, with your trainers, with your the boxers you were going to train with during that time, and then you have living expenses. So if you didn't get some portion of the purse, it was going to be very difficult for you to even go to these fights in the first place. So you forget about that. All of their training expenses, their road fare, their meals, and they didn't live in cheap places at that time.
The entourages, That's
exactly.
Yeah, because I actually saw Jack Johnson preparing for the Jim Jeffries fight, and I remember seeing his entourage. It was 20, 30 people, sparring partners, and it would, and obviously like fast cars at the time, and obviously like you said, high living at the time. That's probably why a lot of them went spend all their money, lost all their money.
And none of your friends had money, so what you would do in your community was to pass out that money, and they all did. They were very charitable.
Oh yeah.
Now, Joe Gans was a different situation. He had quite a bit of money. I think it's estimated that he made up to 100, now by these accounts, you don't know if the newspapers are exaggerating, but in one year he was said to have made about $180,000. Wow. Well, that doesn't include his expense during that year. But if you look at Joe Gans after the 1906 fight, the longest fight, by the way, that was Mark and my art title, the longest fight, not someone else who came along to write the book. But anyway, when you look at those fights, he had tuberculosis and he was suffering, so he had to pay a great deal of money for treatments and things like that.
Tuberculosis was a very common disease at the time in the turn of the century. I don't know nothing about tuberculosis. Can you explain what it is? Because this for me, I don't understand. I don't know what it is, but it was a common thing at the time.
It was very common. It's caused by a bacteria, and remember, there's no penicillin. There's nothing to combat these terrible, tragic diseases. Tuberculosis can lie dormant in your system your entire life. Most all of the boxers, I will say virtually all of the boxers, probably had the germ in them at the time. Even my father did by the 1930s, and he later developed a case late in his life. So that's called latent tuberculosis. But it can become active under any strenuous situation. And certainly Joe Gans was under quite a bit of stress. The great Peter Jackson died of tuberculosis. They all carried the germs.
What does it do to you, tuberculosis, to your body?
Tuberculosis, the most common form, would attack your lungs, and it would cause your the alveoles in your lungs to actually bleed. So you would be coughing up blood, and the way that you would actually perish, and the way that Joe Gans actually perished, was from your lungs filling up with blood, and you would suffocate. You would slowly suffocate. It would be like having an asthma attack continually without any means of help.
Wow. Wow.
So it was a very, very, very contagious, very, very tragic. And if you think of all the spit buckets in those days and the water bottles, and the dirty gems, but really the sputum. I mean, you're coughing and choking in front of everybody, and you're hugging and kissing everybody after the match, and your sweat, everything contains that germ.
Wow, thanks for that question. I've actually pictured that now, because I actually remember loads of fighters. See, at the turn of the century, a lot of them contracted that, and
everybody. I mean, it was the number one illness. While they would say pneumonia was the number one illness of the time, there was very little distinction through the statistics of whether or not it was tuberculosis or pneumonia.
Wow.
Now, tuberculosis in the Gans family, I've been doing a lot of research for the current Gans family and their history. That in their family, their predecessor too died of tuberculosis. They all had it, I think. But it was in the more congested cities and certainly in the more humid areas. That's why people would try to go out west and get into the dry climates, where, literally your sputum would dry before it could reach somebody else, and hopefully it would dry out your lungs. And a very primitive, I don't even want to go into the primitive. Well, maybe I will. But the treatments for that, Joe Gans suffered. Joe Gans was terribly afraid of needles. And think about it. I was afraid. I was an asthmatic. And this is so bizarre, EJ. I grew up in South Texas, and when the doctor said you have to send her west and they said, well, my parents hadn't been anywhere else. They said, where do we take her? And the doctor said from Laredo, Texas, in Mexico, said take her to Prescott, Arizona. It's a very high, dry place. Guess where Joe Gans had to go in the last months of his life? He went to Prescott, Arizona to recuperate. He and I were within 2 blocks. Different. Granted, it was, different, 50 years time difference, maybe 80 years time difference, but, they're in the same place. And so people did try to go out west, but the treatment for that was terrible. Joe Gans was afraid of needles because they didn't have disposable needles. You had to polish the needles to try to get them sharp enough to get into the next person. And they would plunge those needles into his lungs and try to draw off blood from it. The other thing would be they would force fluids down your lungs to try to dilute with what they called germicides. And those germicides were supposed to kill. And then you would, if you were lucky, you wouldn't suffocate from the germicidal treatment that they were flooding your lungs with.
Some of it is, when you mentioned about your father being born on the 13th, is that, and you can see some of the treatment. It's like witchcraft, and I don't know. It's just barbaric, Some of the methods they use to try and cure you, and how superstitious they are,
Yes, they were, and the boxers themselves were. That's another hour of discussion.
Hey, I'm good. Go ahead, Curly, as much as you can. I don't know.
I mean, the superstitions of the boxers. I mean, that was amazing too. I love that. I think every boxer to this day has a superstition. They always wear their favorite token or something, their color, or something into the ring. But in those days, literally, if you had something that would cause you to survive, that was amazing, because you couldn't survive. Now think about poor Joe Gans fighting under those circumstances with tuberculosis, and Peter Jackson fighting with active tuberculosis.
They used to fight with the tuberculosis. I thought they contracted it after they finished fighting. They were fighting with tuberculosis.
Yes, Joe Gans fought his last fight certainly with Nelson with active TB.
Whoa, man! Wow, they've got brave. Go ahead.
Let me tell you, they're not brave. They are tough.
Yeah, man.
42 rounds with active TB.
So that's crazy, you wouldn't even think of it these days. A lot of fighters, they wouldn't go through that. They wouldn't, because how are you breathing?
Exactly. And to be short of breath, and to be coughing, and to be coughing up blood, no less. To me, can you see why these men are my heroes?
Yeah. I mean, I'm there with you and everyone else listening. Listen, I'm telling you, it's these are the things the fight fans need to hear. You can't you can't live on the current fighters. You need to know where these guys came from. They need to know the roots of the fight game.
Yeah, and these were the guys. They were Joe Gans, the early scientific fighters. They perfected, Dal Hawkins actually perfected another early fighter, the left hook. But, these guys perfected these things. Joe Gans, what I love about his techniques that he perfected and that we still do today, you can hear trainers try to prepare these guys for circling their fighter around, so you get them, circle to the right to offset, a particular jab. That circling motion was what Joe Gans perfected.
Yes.
When Jack Johnson says that he looks like he's on skates up there, that's what he's talking about. That circling motion. He's very fluid. Today you just hear people yelling at him, move.
Yeah.
But he was actually circling to measure the angles. And what I love about the Joe Gans opponents, why they were so afraid of Joe Gans, what they worried about, not necessarily afraid of him, because I don't think anybody that stepped into the ring in those days was afraid of anything.
Yeah.
But what they worried about was that they would tell you specifically that Joe Gans had this uncanny knack of knowing what you were going to throw, and he could counter it before you knew you were going to throw it. To me, that was like drawing out your fighter. So Joe Gans then perfected. To me, it's not superstition. He was drawing out the punch that he wanted and had measured to counter.
Yeah. Wow, extraordinary. Even when you see him fight, like you said, he fights like a modern day fighter as you see now.
Thank you. When I first started writing about him, nobody thought people didn't even think he threw combination punches.
Yeah,
I can't believe that.
Yeah, when I saw the footage, I was like, what's this? How can he fight like that? I knew most of the people fought like John L. Sullivan or Jack Johnson, where they clinch in, they grab you, they maul you, hold
rushing.
You down, throwing overhand shots. Joe Gans is pumping at the jab, angles, moving around.
Exactly.
And the fighters of the day, you can see easily, it was easy to counter them type of guys. They never fought that way. And as you said, with Joe Louis, exactly, I never really, I didn't know the connection there,
Absolutely. Jack Backburn tried to teach him to fight just exactly like Joe Louis.
And you could see it because Joe Louis, he used the jab, and everything came off the jab with Joe Louis.
Exactly.
Everything came off the jab with him was perfect,
Exactly.
Wow.
I just thought of something that we haven't talked about.
Go ahead.
And another tactic that happened in the early fights was the infighting.
Yeah.
Think about that.
Yes, the infight.
Because today, how many people can infight today? You're separated.
Yeah. You separate too quickly. The infighting is very important.
Absolutely.
If you like modern day fighters, Floyd Mayweather, he can fight inside. If you really was a really good fighter, you had the infight. That's where the fighting was that was the most brutal as well, because that's when he beat.
Exactly.
I see Fireman Flynn when he was headbutting Jack Johnson.
Yes.
And also when you talk about what's his name again, Gentleman Jim Corbett. I remember I see him teaching Gene Tunney how an infight, when someone threw a punch to his body, how he'd wrap his arm around them and grab his arm and use his other hand to hit him in his jaw and hit to the body. The
absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of damage, and you know what?
Yeah.
That teaches you to throw that 6-inch punch.
Yeah. If it's true, the infighting. Jack Johnson was really good at the infighting.
Oh my gosh, they all were. Really look at when you have to look at it. See, a lot of people don't like that long fight, the 42-round fight with Joe Gans, because they said all they're doing is hugging.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, they're not just hugging.
No, they're not. That's how you. That's what you call. You wear your opponent down. You wear his stamina down.
Absolutely.
Wow.
That was part of Elbow's McFadden's technique, is to keep that pressure on them. Keep them, in the infights. That's where you're absolutely wearing them down. You're keeping that elbow pose.
Yeah.
You're knowing exactly. You're not supposed to be throwing dirty punches, but you're supposed to be, knocking your opponent out in there, which they did.
Yeah. Because I remember they talk about in the old days that they pace themselves. because they knew, like you said, with the 45 rounds, or I remember there was unlimited rounds as well. I heard where until someone dies, until someone goes on their back. Maybe that was bare knuckles, but
those were the bare knuckle fights. But I'm telling you, those could they came back the next day to finish them.
Oh, because it's nighttime and they thought they could.
Yeah.
Really?
They can't see. That's right.
That's crazy.
So they arranged to come back the next day and finish the round.
Yeah, but you know what?
But back you saw a lot of you asked me about the turf fights for the glove fighters.
Yeah.
Yes, the reason you'll see a lot of turf fights, or you'll see a lot of they were barn fights, because they could be in remote locations in somebody's barn, and the people could get in there, and then they wouldn't be immune to the or open to
the authorities were used to
the policemen.
Yeah, because they didn't like them. So let's go into the newspapers, Jack London, and some of the papers at the time where they had their fighters, and some of the verdicts were read. The decisions were read through the papers. Why was that? Why
well, first of all, in early gloved boxing, I can really only speak for that because I know something about the other things, but in the early gloved boxing, the referees made the decisions. There were no other judges. Your referee called the fight. The referee determined. That's where all that comes from, raising the hand, and the referee is calling the fight. So during the period that we're talking about, the referees made the judgment. But remember, public boxing is illegal.
Oh, yes.
It's illegal during this time, and the only state that I know where it was legal was Nevada.
Yeah.
And that's why you had so many fights in Carson City and Reno, and then certainly Goldfield and Tonopah.
Yeah.
Because that was legal in that state, that governor. But the governors were always fighting. Trust me, I think most of the governors always wanted the fights to be legal.
Yeah.
It was the religious reformers who were they were the active opposing force there. So when you see newspaper decisions, remember how important the newspapers were during that time. The newspaper writers, the sports writers, were the most highly paid of all the newspaper reporters, number one. And they were supposed to be the good guys, beyond reproach. And so when you would leave a deposit for a fight in those days, you left them with the newspaper reporter.
Oh, you talking about like the betting were left with the newspapers?
When you post a fight, remember the word is post, P-O-S-T, so you're posting it in the newspaper. So when you make a challenge, when you challenge someone, you have to post money for that to say that you're interested. So you post $1,000. When the post for the fight, if someone doesn't meet your post, there's no fight. But you would post that with the sports writer, and they would keep the money. And so they were judged to be unbiased. They were supposed to be unbiased. And certainly when you would when later you would fight a public fight, but you couldn't do it legally, then and when the states like New York actually outlawed the fights, they would say that they were that you would have a newspaper decision, and the newspaper reporter then would determine how the fight went, who really won the fight.
Yeah. The newspapers them times was really big as well. It was like a map, open up like A to Z map. I heard.
It's so true. But the good thing is we have a lot of stories from boxing we can get from all those huge maps.
Yeah. Oh.
Okay. Anyway, so those are the newspaper writers, and many of the great writers of the period came out of the sports writing. Jack London, the great American writer, Call of the Wild, and Sea Wolf, and all those. He started as a reporter, and he was the one that first coined the term abysmal brute, and that was about Nelson in the Nelson and Britt fight. But of course, later Nelson fought Joe Gans. But Jack London was interesting. There were many interesting newspaper writers we could talk about, but Jack London was interesting because he was so taken with boxing that he required his wife to box with him every day.
Wow, because I don't know much about him. I know the way the golden smile of Jack Johnson. Because I remember, like, at the time when I saw a picture of Jack Johnson at the time, I just took pictures and then I saw his smile, and I understand why he called him the golden smile, because all his teeth were gold.
There you go. I mean, you know, if you were wealthy, you could put gold in your mouth, and
Wow.
and that was the reason. But it was Jack London who coined that phrase. He was the one that made the call for the quote Great White Hope.
Yes.
But if you think about it, you know, before Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries fought? By the way, everybody. You remember Jim Jeffries came in at he was at 300 pounds before he had to start training for that fight. So he lost over 100 pounds, you know, just to go ring with him. But I think he was still a formidable figure. He wasn't able to be matched with Jack Johnson. But you know, there was such a fervor about that fight, calling him out of attention. And trust me, he wasn't going to come into that fight without a lot of money. And you know, that was a lot of money. When you're splitting in 1910, I talk about $25,000, but remember in that fight they split $101,000.
Wow, man, it's a lot of money. And I think he got percentages as well. Did he get on the gate as well? But he had more than Jack Johnson, isn't it?
They did, and they also had the benefit of the fight films, which, remember, the fight films being shown in the theaters were going to make as much money or more than the fights themselves.
They got disallowed, you know. After that, they stopped the fight films in 20 years.
Actually, when Jack Johnson, see, if you were smart, and that's why I love Joe Gans. He always sold his fight films. He got his money right then and there.
You're smart, yeah. That's what you.
I can't remember what he got for the. I think he got. I think Joe Gans got $2,500 just for the fight film of the longest fight. But he was smart. He sold it right then and there because later I think they saw the handwriting on the wall. And certainly with Jack Johnson, then if you were lucky, you sold all your fight film money, and which I think he did. I think he sold it to a syndicate. But regardless, then they lost the money when the fight films were. But it wasn't it was the transporting of the fight films. I think people misunderstand that. They just couldn't cross the lines. But if you happen to have a fight film, you could show it from that state.
Okay. Another thing as well, you know when they were champions, like Tommy Burns there, he really exhibited being a champion. He went like Australia, Canada, London. You know, when they were champions, they went to other people's countries and beat them in their own countries. You know, Tommy Burns did that. You know,
absolutely.
Which they don't do no more with the current champions, where they just stay in America and just fight in America. Where they when Ali was champion, they go, and I think boxers miss that. You know, you call yourself the world champion, and why do you fight people in their other countries?
I think that's so true. I think you need to fight all over the world. If this is to be a world-class sport, you need to take it to the world.
Yeah.
And you know, don't get me started on what needs to be done today. But you know, I'm telling you, we need to bring back boxing to the people.
Yeah.
Not to the rich.
Yeah.
I don't care. I think it's great. When you ask everybody, who's the wealthiest sport today? What sport does that come from? You ask everybody, and what do they? I mean, to the man on the street, what are they going to tell you? They're going to tell you football, or they're going to look at the
basketball.
You know, they're going to look
you call it soccer over there. Soccer, yeah, soccer.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's the sports. It's always the sportsman.
There you go. And but you know, you gotta say who's the wealthiest sport, and that's Floyd Mayweather.
Yeah, Floyd Mayweather.
He's a boxer.
Yeah, he's a boxer. That's it. He's mad. I mean, if the heavyweight get another heavyweight in America, you know that heavy boxing would be great. I think boxing in America, when you have the heavyweight champions, the whole division, the whole boxing is healthier. When America has the heavyweight champion, when America hasn't got a champion, it seems like it's dead. You know?
Well, does that remind you of Jim Jeffries' age?
What, right now?
Yeah.
You know what we was talking about, that the lineage of Lennox Lewis is, in my eyes, is still the champion. I only go by the lineage. Like, in my eyes, Lennox Lewis is still the champion. You need to drag him out like Jim Jeffries and then beat him.
There you go.
Yeah, if you don't do that, go on.
I love Lennox. I love him. We need to get him. You need to interview him too, and we need to bring him back. Let's start a campaign to bring back Lennox Lewis.
You know he said he'll come back if you give him 100 million. I think someone should pay that and bring him up, because if you bring him out and beat him, then you become the linear, and then the lineage can continue. Because when Gene Tunney gave up the lineage after Jack Dempsey, I remember I saw his last fight, and yeah, you know, after he gave it up, it was a long time before Joe Louis. Anyone, you know, it was a long time. It was backwards and forwards, you know, before anyone respected the heavyweights at the time, because they were just fighting Max Baer and all the other guys. But it's very important, the lineage of boxing, because you have to you could backtrack it, like obviously to bare knuckles and so forth. you know?
Absolutely. I think that lineage is really important. And then, obviously there are too many championship titles today. You can bury that hatchet with me, because everybody, I don't think is there anyone that you talk to that doesn't think there are just too many titles?
Yeah, they do. But the thing is, with the fight fans and social media, we unanimously recognize who the champions are. And especially with the up and coming guys, even though you got a lot of champions in the division, we demand them to fight each other. And if they don't fight each other, there's a campaign like with Floyd Mayweather. People are relentlessly calling him a chicken. Why you fight Manny Pacquiao? They were after him. You know what I mean? So it's like, the fight fans with social media, we push that agenda. Like the networks on HBO and Showtime, they control the fighters. From when I interview the fighters, they control the fighters and tell fighters where to go, what to do. But with the social network, they can't get away because we're the paying customers, and especially.
I love it. You got to keep up the work, EJ.
Yeah, we do.
It's all up to you.
This is the YouTube boxing community. A lot of guys like myself, we rigorously come after the fighters and talk to the fighters, and we push that. So the fighters, if they're willing to talk to us, we support them and put their works out there. But this is what boxing is about, especially with the 8 divisions. When boxing with the 8, it was easier. Like with the emergence of the UFC. So he understands the emergence of just having a few divisions where people can recognize who the champions are.
Right.
With boxing, it's the same thing. It's easier when you have all them 8 divisions. It's just fine. But as you said, boxing at a state in a minute. But look, we can't complain. It's coming on network TV. So it's getting a bit better anyway. So we're getting to see a lot of fights, like we said yesterday. But
and I think it's great for what you're doing. I think it's up to you, and I thank you so much, EJ, for appreciating the history of this great sport.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone doesn't appreciate the history of Joe Gans and all the other guys, what they went through, Sam Blanford, Jack Johnson, and all the greats, what they went through, I can't understand. A lot of the fans, these days they appreciate like one fighter, but if you're any sort of fan of the sport, you have to appreciate what the guys went through. Like you said with Mike Tyson, he was a big fan. Anyone like Mike, a lot of people love Mike Tyson. So if you love Mike Tyson, you got to be a fan of what he liked, and he liked all the old fighters.
Absolutely.
He all the old fighters. Like you said, he's a very astute about everything, all the fight film, and the fight films are very important. I'm not obviously next time we talk again, I'd love to sit down and we go through fight films of all-time greats.
I would love to do that. So let's make a promise that we'll do that. We'll sit down with some of these old fight films and we'll walk through them.
Yeah, definitely.
Your fans.
Definitely. You think it's like maybe we've run out now. I don't know if you want to continue talking, but where can the fight fans catch you? And also your works, your books and stuff.
Let me. I haven't updated the Joe Gans website, joegans.com. Anyone out there can get a message directly to me, and I will respond through joegans.com.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So if you want to correspond to me directly, you can. Obviously, the books are in all the libraries. The publisher of the 3 books is actually, they're headquartered in London there, McFarlane.
Okay.
So, you can get, obviously those books are at McFarlane or on Amazon, or I don't know what's easier for international people, but you can find them. And we're all, the boxing historians, we're out there trying to write as much as we can in all the publications, and people are self-publishing today, which I have to admire. When Mark and I were writing our first book, there were very few of us writing boxing histories at all, but now through the internet and through Lulu and through self-publishing and smaller presses, there are more boxing books on history of boxing out there now than there ever were before, and I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, it'd be wonderful if one of the fight guys in the thing would make a film on one of your books. Well, I
would love that. I would love to write it.
Listen, I would love it, because the thing is, for them going through your books, they'd have a more accurate assess of what some of the fighters went through, because
absolutely, and I think you have to have the context. I think if you just put up if you just write a screenplay and you don't have the context, if you don't know, the things that were happening as they walked into the this gym this arena that was built for $40,000 just for that fight.
Yes, out of wood, lumber, and build up. I mean, the biggest.
And guess what? And guess what? They built it in 3 weeks.
Yeah. I mean, like, look, I saw the Jack Johnson and the James Jeffries, the way they built that stadium just for that fight. It was wow, massive. It was like one of them Greek.
It was
Colosseums.
Yes.
Full of number.
So. At another time, we'll have to talk about Tex Rickard, but how he was able to bring back those staged events as big as anything in the Roman Colosseum.
Yeah.
That's what Tex Rickard did for boxing. Yeah. And if you don't think he's not the father of modern boxing, yes, he's very important too.
Yeah, we're definitely, because I know obviously you got another date with Al Bernstein. When is that? Because I'm definitely going to tune in for the part 2 of you and Al Bernstein. I'm looking. Yeah, I can't wait for that. So let the fight fans know when that's going to happen, and obviously we'll try and catch you after that maybe.
That would be great. I think they were talking about early February, and I think that's next week. But
yeah, good. That's it. I get my next dose. That's it.
That's funny, but I haven't arranged that specifically. But I know it'll be soon. I know they were talking about doing that very soon. So I'll give you a shout out when I have a date on that.
Okay, that'll be. Clean. You know what? This was back. Like, what I'm gonna do, I'll sort this out and I'll post it everywhere. And you fight fans, try get in contact with Colleen. Obviously through the website joegans.com, and also the book. If you've got time, sit down and read the books. And it's been a great interview, and we look forward to talking to you again very soon.
EJ, I really look forward to that, and I just think that I can't stress what you're doing is so important, because you're bringing that to the people. You're encouraging the people to know their history. You're encouraging people to watch the current fights and to demand something from the sport.
Yes.
And that is so important. And I love you for doing that, EJ. Thank you so much.
We thank you as well, Colleen. You definitely bring back the stuff that people maybe forgot, and you keep it prevalent. And like some of the stuff you mentioned today, I'm gonna sit back and drink a coffee and listen to this interview again, and I'll probably listen to it a couple more times. It's one of the greatest interviews I've ever had. I think it's on par, even better than the Steve Lott interview I had. It's historic. It's historic as well as the stuff you've got. Thank you, Colleen, so much, and we'll catch up very soon.
Very good. I love you so much. Bye bye.
Take it. Bye.